My name is Emily Lawson, and I am 29 years old and I live in the beautiful, but often gray city of Portland, Oregon. For a long time, I thought I was living the American dream, but it turned out to be a nightmare wrapped in expensive paper and tied with a silk bow. I moved to Portland when I was 24 years old, hoping for a fresh start in a place that valued creativity and kindness. I met David Lawson at a charity event for the local library, and he seemed like everything I had ever wanted. He was handsome and successful, and came from one of those old money families that have their names on the side of hospital wings. We got married 2 years later, and that was when the walls started to close in on me. The Lawson family is not just a family, but it is a machine, and every person in it is expected to be a perfect part that never squeaks or breaks. David's mother, whose name is Beatrice, was the leader of this machine, and she made it clear from day one that I was an outsider who needed to be molded. They lived in a massive house in the West Hills where the clouds always seem to touch the rooftops, and the air feels thin and cold. In that house, I was told what to wear and what to say, and even how to sit during dinner. David was not the man I thought he was because he was completely under his mother's thumb, and he used his words like tiny knives to cut my confidence down every single day. He would tell me that I was lucky to be a Lawson, and that without him, I would be nothing but a girl working in a coffee shop with no future. The emotional abuse was quiet, and it was constant like a dripping faucet that you can never turn off. They controlled my bank account, and they controlled my schedule, and they constantly talked about the importance of the Lawson bloodline. To them, the most important thing in the world was passing on their name and their heritage to the next generation. They spoke about their ancestors as if they were gods, and they expected me to provide the next heir to their kingdom. But as the years went by, I realized that I did not want to bring a child into this toxic cycle of control and cruelty. I watched how Beatrice treated David and how David treated me, and I saw a pattern of psychological chains that went back for decades. I was scared that if I had a child with David, that child would grow up to be just like him, or even worse, they would be broken by him, just like I was being broken. I felt trapped because I had no money of my own and my family lived far away and did not have the means to help me escape. The laws of the Lawson family were simple, and you either followed the rules or you were cast out into the cold with nothing. I started to look for a way to take back my power in a way that they could never take away from me. I wanted a revenge that was quiet and invisible, but also total and permanent. I wanted to break their precious bloodline without them ever knowing that it had been broken. One day I was at the doctor's office, and I overheard a conversation that changed everything. David had always insisted that if we were not getting pregnant, it must be my fault, because a Lawson man is perfect in every way. But I found out through a lucky mistake with some medical paperwork that David was actually the one who could not have children. He had known this for years, but he never told me because his pride was more important than the truth. He was letting me believe I was the failure while he walked around with his head held high. That was the moment I decided what I was going to do. I did not want to just leave because they would use their lawyers to destroy me and I would end up with nothing. I wanted to stay and watch them pour all their love and money and hope into something that was not theirs. I wanted to plant a seed in their garden that did not belong to them. I started spending more time at the public library under the excuse of joining a book club so I could use the computers there without being tracked. I went onto the internet and started looking at forums where people talked about alternative ways to start a family. I found a community of people who were looking for casual connections, and some who were even looking to help women become mothers without the middleman of a sperm bank or a doctor's office. I was very careful because I knew the risks of meeting strangers, and I knew about diseases and the danger of people with bad intentions. I used a fake name and a burner telephone that I bought with cash at a convenience store. I looked for someone who was the opposite of David in every way. I wanted someone who was kind and humble and had no interest in power or money. I eventually found a man who seemed perfect for what I needed. He was a traveler passing through the Pacific Northwest, and he had a very calm and peaceful energy. We met at a small park near the river where the sound of the water drowned out our conversation. He was a simple man who worked with his hands, and he did not ask me many questions about my life. I told him I wanted a child, but I did not want a partner, and he respected that. We met during the time of the month when I knew I was most likely to conceive. It was not a romantic experience, but it was a human one, and it felt like the first time in years that I was making a choice for myself. After our meeting, he went on his way, and I never saw him again, and I never even learned his real last name. I went back to the Lawson mansion, and I pretended that everything was normal. I continued to endure the comments from Beatrice about my lack of a pregnancy, and I listened to David's insults about my worth as a wife. I waited with a secret heart that was beating faster every day. 2 weeks later, I took a test in the middle of the night, and the 2 pink lines appeared like a miracle. I felt a rush of joy that was mixed with a dark sense of satisfaction. I was pregnant, but the Lawson bloodline ended with David, even though he would never know it. When I told the family, the news they erupted with a fake kind of joy that made my skin crawl. Beatrice threw a massive party at a country club and invited all of their wealthy friends to announce the coming of the new heir. They toasted to the Lawson name, and they talked about how the family legacy would continue for another 100 years. David acted like a proud king who had finally conquered a new land. He put his hand on my stomach as if he owned the life growing inside me, and he took all the credit for our success. I smiled, and I nodded, and I played the part of the happy wife. I let them buy me expensive clothes, and I let them hire the best doctors money could buy. I watched as they spent thousands of dollars on a nursery that looked like something out of a magazine. Every time they talked about the baby's future and how he or she would grow up to lead the Lawson empire, I had to bite my tongue to keep from laughing. The irony was so thick I could almost taste it. But as the months went by, the stress of the lie started to take a toll on me. I became worried that the baby would look nothing like David and that someone would notice. David has dark hair and blue eyes, and the man I met had sandy hair and brown eyes. I spent hours looking in the mirror and wondering which of my features would be dominant. I started to have nightmares that Beatrice would demand a DNA test as soon as the baby was born. She was a suspicious woman who did not trust anyone, and she often made comments about how I was just a vessel for her grandchild. I tried to pull away and set some boundaries, but every time I did, David would remind me that I was living in his house and eating his food. He became even more controlling during the pregnancy, and he wanted to know every single thing I ate and every person I talked to. He even hired a private driver for me so that I would never have to be alone in the city. I felt like a prisoner in a gold cage, and the walls were getting closer. I tried to argue with him about the driver, but he just laughed and told me that he was protecting his investment. That word stung more than any of his other insults, because it confirmed that I was nothing more than a thing to him. I realized that my plan was working, but it was also making my daily life much harder. The high of the revenge was being weighed down by the reality of my situation. I was still being abused, and now I was being watched even more closely than before. I started to feel like I had made a mistake and that I should have just run away when I had the chance. One night, David got very angry because I had stayed at the library an hour longer than I was supposed to. He screamed at me until his face turned red, and he told me that he could take the baby away from me the moment it was born if I did not learn to obey him. He said that the Lawsons always get what they want, and that I was lucky they were even letting me keep the child for the first 9 months. I went to bed crying, and I realized that I had to be smarter. I had to make sure that they were so convinced the baby was theirs that they would never dream of questioning it. I started to do research on genetics, and I learned that many traits are not as simple as they look in textbooks. I also started to act even more submissive, and I began to agree with everything Beatrice said. I told her that I wanted her to help me pick the baby's name, and I asked her for advice on how to raise a Lawson. This made her feel powerful, and it lowered her guard. She started to treat me like a favorite pet instead of an enemy. But the pressure was still building, and I knew that the day of the birth would be the ultimate test. As the due date approached, the Lawson family prepared for the arrival like it was a royal birth. They had a wing of the hospital reserved, and they had a team of nurses on call. I felt like I was walking to my own execution, even though I was the one who had set the trap. On the day I went into labor, the entire family was there in the waiting room. David was in the room with me, acting like he was a hero for just standing there. The labor was long and painful, and there were moments when I thought I couldn't go through with it. I was terrified that when the baby came out, the truth would be written all over his face. But when the baby finally arrived and the nurse handed him to me, I saw a beautiful little boy with a head full of dark hair. He looked just like a baby should look, and in that moment he didn't look like anyone but himself. David leaned over and whispered that he was a perfect Lawson. Beatrice came into the room a few minutes later, and she was crying real tears, which was something I had never seen before. She held the baby and looked at his tiny fingers, and she said that he had the Lawson hands. I almost laughed because my donor also had long fingers, but to her, they were proof of his royal bloodline. In the weeks that followed, the baby, whom we named Arthur, became the center of their entire world. They doted on him, and they bought him everything he could ever need. David became even more arrogant, and he started telling everyone that Arthur was going to be even more successful than he was. I watched them pour all their resources into this child, and I felt a sense of peace that I had never known. I had successfully introduced a complete stranger into their precious lineage, and they were paying for the privilege. My revenge was not loud, and it did not involve fire or screaming, but it was a total victory. I had broken the cycle of abuse because I knew that I would never let Arthur grow up believing the Lawson lies. I would raise him to be kind, and I would tell him the truth about his family when he was old enough to understand. Not the truth about his biological father, but the truth about the people who raised him. I would make sure he knew that money and names do not define a person. But there was one more thing I had to do to ensure my freedom. Over the first year of Arthur's life, I slowly began to document the emotional abuse and the threats David had made. I used a hidden recorder that I kept in my jewelry box, and I captured hours of him belittling me and talking about how he only wanted the baby for the sake of the legacy. I also found a way to get a copy of his medical records that proved he was infertile. I kept these things in a safe place that only I knew about. I knew that if David ever tried to take Arthur away from me, I had enough evidence to destroy him and his family's reputation. One afternoon, while Arthur was napping and David was at work, Beatrice came over to the house. She was sitting in the nursery looking at a portrait of David's grandfather, and she started talking about how proud the old man would be. She looked at me and said that I had finally done something right for the family. She said that I should be grateful that Arthur had the Lawson strength and that he didn't inherit my weak commoner traits. I looked her right in the eye and I didn't blink. I told her that Arthur is exactly who he is supposed to be and that his future has nothing to do with her past. She looked shocked that I had spoken back to her, and she started to get angry, but I just walked away. I realized then that I was no longer afraid of her. I had a secret power that they could never touch. They were building a temple to a god that didn't exist, and they were using their own money to do it. As Arthur grew, he started to show his own personality. He was a happy and curious child, and he didn't have the coldness that I saw in David. He loved to play in the rain, and he loved to look at the roses in our garden. He was a bright light in a very dark house. David tried to start training him even as a toddler, telling him that he had to be the best and that he had to win at everything. But I was always there to balance it out and to tell Arthur that it was okay to just be himself. The revenge was working in ways I hadn't even expected. The Lawsons were so focused on Arthur that they started to leave me alone more. They thought they had already gotten what they wanted from me, so they stopped trying to control my every move. I used this new freedom to start saving money in a secret account and to prepare for my eventual departure. I knew I couldn't stay in that house forever, but I wanted to wait until the time was right. I wanted to wait until Arthur was old enough to travel and until I had enough leverage to make sure they could never follow us. The ultimate consequence of my choice was that I became the master of the Lawson house without any of them knowing it. I was the one who held all the cards, and I was the one who decided the future of their name. It was a poetic justice that a family so obsessed with blood and heritage was being sustained by a lie. They were pouring their life's work into a child that was biologically a stranger to them, and they were doing it with smiles on their faces. One evening, there was a big dinner party to celebrate Arthur's second birthday. The house was filled with the elite of Portland, and the champagne was flowing. David stood up and gave a long speech about the Lawson legacy and how Arthur was the crowning achievement of their family history. He looked so smug and so sure of himself. I sat there in my expensive dress, and I looked at my beautiful son who was eating a piece of cake, and I felt a surge of triumph. I knew that in David's eyes, he was seeing a reflection of himself, but I was seeing a new beginning. I was seeing a boy who would never have to be a Lawson in his heart. After the party ended, and the guests had gone home, David was sitting in his study looking at his bank statements. He called me in and told me that he was going to set up a massive trust fund for Arthur that would be worth millions of dollars by the time he was 18. He said that he wanted to make sure that the Lawson wealth stayed in Lawson hands forever. I smiled, and I told him that it was a very generous idea. I felt a chill of excitement because I knew that money would one day help Arthur and me start a completely new life far away from Portland. My revenge was a gift that kept on giving. I had not only protected my child from their toxic nature, but I had also secured our financial future using their own greed against them. I went to the nursery, and I watched Arthur sleep, and I whispered to him that he was free. He didn't know it yet, but the chains that had bound the Lawsons for generations had been broken the night he was conceived. The irony was that the family's obsession with their own perfection was the very thing that made them blind to the truth. They were so convinced of their own superiority that they couldn't imagine a world where they could be tricked. They thought I was a simple girl from a small town who was lucky to be in their presence, but I was the one who had rewritten their history. As I stand here today looking out at the Portland rain, I know that my time in this house is coming to an end. I have the recordings, and I have the medical records, and I have the secret savings. Most importantly, I have my son. When we leave, it will be on my terms, and the Lawsons will have to choose between their reputation and their heir. I know they will choose the reputation because that is all they have ever truly cared about. They will let us go, and they will tell their friends some story about why I had to move away, and they will keep sending money because they want to believe that the Lawson line is still going strong. They will live a lie for the rest of their lives, and I will live the truth. I realized that the best kind of revenge is not one that destroys your enemies in a single blow, but one that lets them live in a world of their own making while you walk away into the sunlight. I have taken control of my own life, and I have created a healthier environment for my child than the one I had known. I am no longer Emily Lawson, the victim of emotional abuse, but I am Emily Lawson, the architect of a new future. I am no longer afraid of the dark clouds over the West Hills because I know that I am the one who brings the light. My revenge was simple, and it was quiet, and it was perfect. It was a peace of mind that I bought with a single brave choice. I look at Arthur, and I see a boy who will grow up to be a man of character and not just a man of a name. I have won, and the Lawsons will never even know that the game has ended. The cycle is broken, and the future is mine. I think back to that day in the park by the river, and I thank the man who didn't know he was helping me start a revolution. I think about David and Beatrice, and I feel a strange kind of pity for them because they are trapped in a world of ghosts and shadows while I am finally awake. The rain in Portland doesn't seem so gray anymore because I know that it is just water that helps things grow. My life is like that rain, and it is washing away the old and making room for the new. I am 29 years old, and my life is just beginning. I have learned that you don't have to be loud to be heard, and you don't have to be mean to get even. Sometimes the best revenge is simply being happy and knowing something that no one else knows. I am going to take Arthur, and we are going to go to a place where the air is warm and the people are kind. We are going to leave the Lawson name behind, and we are going to start a legacy of our own. A legacy of truth and love and freedom. And every time I see a Lawson name on the side of a building, I will just smile and keep walking. I will know that their empire is built on sand and that my son is the wind that will blow it all away. This is my story, and this is my victory. I am no longer a part of their machine, and I am no longer a piece of their puzzle. I am a woman who took her power back in the most beautiful way possible. I am free. I spent the next few months carefully planning our departure from Portland. I knew that I couldn't just vanish into thin air because that would raise too much suspicion. I started by looking for jobs in other states where the Lawson family didn't have any business connections. I found a great opportunity in a small coastal town in California where the weather was beautiful and the lifestyle was much slower. I applied for the job using my maiden name, and I did the interviews over the computer at the public library. When I got the job offer, I felt a huge weight lift off my shoulders. It was a real job with a good salary, and it would allow me to support Arthur and myself without anyone's help. I also started to slowly move some of our personal belongings to a storage unit that I had rented in a different part of the city. I only took things that were truly important to me, and I made sure that nothing went missing from the Lawson mansion that would be noticed. I wanted the house to look exactly the same until the very moment we left. David was still busy with his work and his social life, and he didn't notice that anything was different. He was so wrapped up in his own world that he didn't see that I was preparing to leave him. He would come home late and talk about his meetings and his deals, and I would just nod and listen. He still made his cruel comments, but they didn't hurt me anymore because I knew they were the last ones I would ever have to hear. One night, I was sitting in the living room with Beatrice, and she was talking about Arthur's future education. She wanted him to go to the same private school that David had attended, and she was already talking to the headmaster about getting him on the waiting list. She looked at me and said that it was important for Arthur to be around the right kind of people from an early age. I looked at her, and I realized that she would never change. She would always see the world in terms of status and power. I felt a sudden urge to tell her the truth right then and there just to see the look on her face, but I held my tongue. I knew that the silence was part of my revenge. The day we finally left was a Tuesday, and David was out of town on a business trip to Seattle. Beatrice was at her bridge club, and the house was quiet. I woke up early, and I packed the last of our things into my car, which I had parked down the street the night before. I walked through the house one last time, and I looked at all the expensive furniture and the paintings and the gold leaf on the ceilings. It all looked like trash to me now. I went to the nursery, and I picked up Arthur, who was still sleepy, and I carried him out to the car. I didn't leave a note, and I didn't send a text. I just started the engine, and I drove away from the West Hills, and I didn't look back. As I drove south toward California, I felt a sense of freedom that I can't even describe. It was like I was breathing for the first time in my life. Arthur was happy in the back seat, and he was playing with his favorite toy. We stopped at a diner for breakfast, and I sat there looking at my son, and I realized that we were finally safe. I knew that the Lawsons would eventually find out we were gone, and I knew that they would be furious. I knew that they would try to find us, but I also knew that they wouldn't go to the police because they didn't want any scandal. They would try to handle it quietly, and they would soon realize that I had the evidence to stop them. A few days after we arrived in our new town, I received a phone call from David. He was screaming, and he was making all kinds of threats. I waited until he was done talking, and then I told him very calmly that I had recordings of his abuse, and I had his medical records that proved he couldn't be Arthur's father. The silence on the other end of the line was the most satisfying thing I have ever heard. He didn't say another word, and he hung up the phone. I haven't heard from him or Beatrice since then. I know that they are living in their big house in Portland, and I know that they are telling everyone that I was a crazy woman who kidnapped their heir. But I don't care what they say. I am living my life, and I am raising my son in a place where he is loved for who he is and not for his name. My revenge is complete, and it is permanent. I have broken the Lawson bloodline, and I have saved my son from a life of misery. I am Emily Lawson, and I am finally the person I was always meant to be. I am happy, and I am free. The long journey from Portland to California was more than just a drive because it was a transition from darkness into light. Every mile that passed was a mile between me and the emotional prison I had lived in for so many years. I watched the scenery change from the thick green forests of Oregon to the golden hills of California, and it felt like the world was opening up to welcome us. Arthur was a great traveler, and he seemed to sense that we were on an adventure. We stayed in small hotels, and we ate at local diners, and for the first time, I didn't have to worry about what I was wearing or how I was acting. I could just be a mother with her son, and it was the most natural feeling in the world. When we finally reached the coast, and I saw the ocean for the first time, I stopped the car, and we walked down to the sand. The air was salty and warm, and the sound of the waves was so much better than the cold rain of Portland. I let Arthur run around and play in the water, and I felt a deep sense of peace. This was the life I had wanted, and this was the future I had fought for. My new job was even better than I expected, and the people I worked with were kind and supportive. They didn't care about my last name or my background, and they valued me for my skills and my hard work. I found a small house near the beach that had a big yard for Arthur to play in, and I spent my weekends decorating it with things that I actually liked. There was no gold leaf or expensive paintings, but there was a lot of color and a lot of love. I started to make friends with the other parents in the neighborhood, and I realized that most people are actually good and decent. The toxic world of the Lawsons was just a small and ugly part of the world, and I was glad to be out of it. As the months passed, Arthur grew bigger and stronger, and he started to talk more. He has a funny little laugh and a very kind heart. He loves to help me in the garden, and he loves to go for walks on the beach. I look at him, and I see a child who is free from the expectations of a legacy. He doesn't have to be perfect, and he doesn't have to be a leader. He just has to be Arthur. I sometimes think about the Lawsons, and I wonder what they are doing. I imagine Beatrice is still hosting her parties, and I imagine David is still making his deals. I wonder if they ever think about the child they thought was theirs, or if they have already moved on to the next thing. I suspect that they are mostly embarrassed and that they are doing everything they can to keep their friends from finding out the truth. Their pride is their own prison, and they will never be truly happy because they don't know how to love anything but themselves. My revenge was not about hurting them as much as it was about saving myself and Arthur. I realized that the best way to get back at someone who treats you like you are nothing is to prove that you are everything. I am a strong woman, and I am a good mother, and I am a person who has value. I don't need a Lawson name to be someone, and I don't need their money to be happy. I have everything I need right here in this small town by the sea. I know that there will be challenges in the future, and I know that raising a child as a single mother is not always easy. But I am not afraid because I have already survived the worst that life could throw at me. I have the strength of a woman who has fought for her freedom, and I have the wisdom of a woman who has seen the truth. I'm going to make sure that Arthur grows up knowing that he can be whoever he wants to be and that he should always be kind to others. I'm going to teach him that the most important thing in the world is not power or wealth, but the love you have for the people around you. My life is full of light now, and the gray days of Portland are just a distant memory. I have taken my revenge, and I have turned it into a new beginning. I am Emily Lawson, and I am free. I am happy. I am home.